Welcome to Agronomy Moment. I'm your host, Wendell Cohen. We bring in people who agree with me, disagree with me, and above all, are not afraid to say it like it is.
Hey, welcome back here to Agronomy Moment. We wanted to do a really quick update here relating to some agronomy things we're seeing out in the field. And right behind me, you can see we thought this would make a nice backdrop to the conditions we're in case there's any market guys watching or anything. This is what it's looking like in our local area right now. We've got water rushing across the field. We've got water backing up into some ditches here. And the thing, though, actually we're going to talk about is not so much the environmental concerns here. I have Scott Dickey with me today, and I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to start off by cutting open a corn plant, like what we're seeing out in the fields, things like this, and show us what we're to look for as far as weathering some of this high water, high saturated soils, perhaps flooding of your soils, and what to look for when we see waters go down, recede, and recover. And so we want to make sure we're making good choices as we go forward on what the future and the life of your crop has. So turn it over to Scott. So Scott here is going to open up check the growing point here, making this little cut here. And
there you go.
And you can see, I'm going to try to focus here. There we go. That's a little better focus. Right where he's pointing, you see that little darker spot. Scott, can you tell us what we're kind of looking for, though, in terms of if it wasn't the right color?
Right. You know, down the road, it's awful early yet for us to be looking at corn plants to try to decide whether or not they're healthy and ready to go yet. But one of the first things a person will do is look at the growing points. You know, they're going to still be 3/4 of an inch or so below ground, at least.
Yes.
And, you know, if they're still white, they're going to be in pretty good shape. Like these here that you see, these white coloration of the growing point, that means these guys are in great shape.
Yeah.
If we started to see a little bit of browning in this zone, then that would be a bit of concern. You know, if we saw much browning at all,
yeah,
I'd probably tend to, at this growth stage, this early in the season, consider this to be plants that I wouldn't want to keep.
Yeah.
You know, if I saw browning in there, you know, which would be a sure sign of a disease in there destroying tissue.
Okay.
But right now, these look great. Granted, now these plants came from an upland field, you know, that is still saturated, but
right,
it's draining. So it'll be interesting to see. And
like what we have out there.
Fields that are underwater, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
What we wind up with. And, you know, typically, you know, it's warm today, but this is really our first warm day we've had since the flooding began. You know, typically you're looking at 48 hours of total submersion at this stage is probably okay. One thing we'll have to watch, corn that is younger than V6, the growing points stay underground, so they're more susceptible to disease issues in those saturated conditions, causing problems with them. But I still think we have 48 to 72 hours typically, especially when we're cool like we are right now. It's going to be a case-by-case situation, and I think in a week or so, people can go out and start evaluating some of their stands to determine whether or not they have issues or not.
And Scott, just a little bit, just briefly, talk a little bit, you know, like the water we see here in the background there in the middle that's running pretty good. Talk a little bit about that, where we actually have flooded soils.
Sure.
and what the different areas we might see.
You know, historically, when we have current flowing through a field, that's a better situation than when we have ponded water. So current situation, if you had water flowing through a field, you have longer before the plants are damaged, as opposed to a creek that's maybe a side creek that's being backed into by a main creek, where you get standing water with no current at all. That's usually going to be a worse situation than when you have current.
Yep.
So you have a couple different factors there, but they all basically are boiling down to how quickly we rob all of the seed and plant zone of oxygen. When we run out of oxygen, that's when we start to have problems, and the current here can help with situations in terms of maintaining oxygen levels, it seems like, but also when we stay cooler, respiration rate of the corn plants is lower, so they're burning less oxygen that's available. So that's why you see such variances in how long the plants are going to be able to tolerate the conditions.
Nice. And would you talk just a little bit, if you would, is there anything we can see in soybeans, and where are we looking at for life, like, you know, in saturated conditions?
Similar, you know, we're probably looking at 48, 72 hours submerged that they can tolerate. You know, same thing. We're going to have to just look and see how, if we do happen to kill the main growing point of the plants, looking at to see whether secondary buds near the cotyledons and the unifoliate leaves are still present. If they're below ground, it's just going to be a case by case of whether or not we can establish an adequate stand.
Okay.
One other thing to me for us to consider for corn is the potential for crazy top. When we're in situations of V1 corn, which a lot of this corn is roughly V1, we can have situations where it gets an infection from a fungus that causes crazy top, and your incidence rate of crazy top will be highest on plants that are at V1 when they go submerged. Once they get a little older, they're less susceptible to that issue than when they're young like they are today.
Okay.
So that would be something to watch, especially in fields where you have a lot of standing ponded water.
Yes.
I think would be a higher risk than current water for that as well.
Of that infection beginning.
Yep. And then, I know you guys have done some videos on nitrogen and
Yes.
nitrogen management. There will be some situations here where, in fields particularly where we had fall anhydrous, where we may have a higher percentage of our nitrogen converted to the nitrate form, where we could have had some denitrification losses with these saturated soil conditions, especially as soil temperatures are warmer. If you get into the 60s to 70 degree range, those loss rates are much higher than when we're at cooler temperatures.
So we've had a really good spring up till this big rain, and so we need to see what the story unfolds here as we watch nitrogen. And
absolutely. Most of these upland fields, they're tolerating this fine. It's just certain situations here, ponded water and then flooding.
Nice. Thank you, Scott.
You bet. There you go.
And also, just in closing, Scott talked about nitrogen. I just wanted to mention to you, as that story unfolds, we're watching this really closely. All of our agronomists on our team are doing that as well at Beck's, and I myself is trying to keep an eye on fields as it relates to nitrogen. But feel free to holler at me anytime if you have questions or concerns about what your nitrogen loss might be, and we can dive into that. Also know that Selena and I put out a video last week. It was actually shot way earlier, but we released it last week for you. It's early corn management, and it has some really key strategic things in there as far as nitrogen management and what to look for. But feel free to reach out to me anytime. Thank you. See you.